All right. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Wow, I'm really excited by everyone that's here. Thank you so much for joining. What I wanted to do today is kind of give you an overview of what's happening in the plant-based protein or plant-based meat, egg, and dairy industry, and sort of step into the area of crop optimization as kind of the finishing point to open up a discussion. And I'll center my presentation today around some of the white space ideas that we've identified in this sector, and also touch on the research projects that we're funding through our competitive grant initiative, some of which I think you'll be very interested in. All right, I'll do a brief introduction. Near already touched on this point, but one of the big questions that drives our work, and I'm sure much of your work as well, is this question of the number of people that are going to live on the planet by 2050, 9.7 to 10 billion people, and how can we do that in a way that is more sustainable, efficient, and safe as well. And just a couple of data points here on what we're seeing in terms of food security and global poverty challenges when we look at how the population is going to change over the coming years, right? It's going to continue to grow, but we'll see much higher growth in developing regions such as Africa and Oceania. So as we look forward to 2050, we're not only going to have more people to feed, but where they live is going to change as well. And estimates are that we're going to need to produce a significantly more calories. If we go back to 2016 and then look forward to 2050, we need to close roughly about a 70% gap between the amount of food produced in 2006 and what's needed by 2050. And that data comes from the World Resources Institute. So we have a bunch more calories to produce. And what we see when we look at how consumption of different food products changes as the per capita income changes, as income goes up, meat consumption goes up as well. And we see this trend happening in every country around the world. So as people have more disposable income, they tend to buy more and consume more and more meat. And this is captured, I think, on this graph here, right, where you see again a comparison to looking forward to 2050 and seeing that in all categories, the amount of animal products, specific and in particular meat, the amount of demand is going to go up. Poultry is a really great example on this slide, where we see a population increase of 30% from 2005 to 2050, but a demand for poultry going up by 120%. So large growth in the amount of meat that's going to be that people are going to want to consume as we move forward and the population increases. I'm sure you're all aware of some of the challenges with the way that we produce animal products, in particular meat today, impact on the environment, water usage, greenhouse gas emissions, etc. Antimicrobial resistance, I think, is an important one to think about as well. Estimates today put the number of deaths related to superbugs or antimicrobial resistance in the 700,000 per annum. But if we leave this issue unchecked and don't do things to solve this, we're looking at deaths in the region of 10 million per year by that 2050 year in the future. So that's more than all deaths from all cancers combined today, costing somewhere in the region of $100 trillion in global health costs by 2050 as well. And then the last challenge I'll mention is just these market disrupting events. In fact, I think we're all living through one right now. But this example here is related to swine, relates to swine flu that we've seen really devastate the pig industry over the last couple of years. Hundreds of outbreaks in China. Over half of China's breeding pigs being culled or dying as a result of swine flu. And you can see on the left the impact this has as the number of pigs goes down. and pork goes up. And this this shows that the existing animal agriculture industry is very sensitive to these types of disruptions and is also ripe for disruption as well. Fortunately, as all of you know, because you're working on these, plant proteins are a far more sustainable source of protein and calories than their animal counterparts. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions, water usage, all the factors that contribute to environmental sustainability across the board, plant proteins of various kinds are far more sustainable. And so we've begun to see a shift in the number of products launched that use plants and have a vegan claim. This graph here only goes to 2017, but this growth continues as well. So it's not just a fad. It's really a trend where we're seeing more and more products launched around the world that have a vegan claim and don't contain any animal products. And there's some really optimistic outlooks in terms of how fast and how big this plant-based meat market is projected to reach in the next 10 to 15 years. On this slide, we've aggregated several analyst projections from some pretty well-known market research firms. And you can see that there's some variance here. On the top is in green is the US market outlooks, and then on the bottom in orange is the global market projections. But I think if you take all of this together, what we can expect to see is a growth to a 10% market share. We're sitting at about 1% market share globally right now in terms of the plant-based meat market versus the entire meat market. So we expect to see a growth to 10% market share. If you look at UBS, they're estimating this market is going to be worth about $85 billion with a 6% share. And then the very bullish estimate from A.T. Kearney puts this at over a $300 billion industry with a 23% market share. So either way, we're looking at very rapid growth over the next 10 to 15 years, and this turning into a very big industry in terms of global revenue as well. One, I think, interesting way to think about the potential growth is to look at what's happened in plant-based milk. On this slide here, we're looking at just the US retail market, which is where we have really good data, but you can extrapolate this out to the global market or just think about Israel as well. So in the US, over the past 10 to 12 years, we've seen the plant-based milk market grow from about a 1 to 2% market share of the total milk market to now capturing 14% of that retail market in the US. And if you look around the world, the market share now for plant-based milk is roughly about the same, somewhere between 10 to 15%, depending on the region. So if we look at plant-based meat, which currently today in the US has a 1% share of the total retail market, so similar to what plant-based milk used to have, and look at capturing that other 13%, just in the US retail market alone, that's worth $12 billion. And I think there's a lot of analogies we can see in terms of the types of products that have been launched and how they've been marketed on the plant-based milk side as to what's happening in the plant-based meat side. So I don't think it takes a lot of thought to see that this is very likely to happen over the coming years in the plant-based meat space as well. And I'll end my introduction with this slide here, which I think is important to think about as we go through more into the science, is that this market growth is not being driven by the vegan and vegetarian consumers of the world, which continue to sit at about 6% of the total population. It's really being driven by the omnivores and flexitarians of the world that are becoming more aware, more conscious of these, the impact that intensive animal agriculture is having on the environment. But they love the taste of meat, eggs, and dairy, and they want to continue eating it, but want to do so in a more environmentally and socially conscious way. So they're not, if you think back to say 5 to 10 years ago, a vegan or vegetarian consumer would have been happy with, a regular texturized soy protein product. This is not the case for the omnivores and vegetarians of the world. They want something that tastes as good as or better than the conventional meat, egg, or dairy product that they're trying to replace. So really, that's how the market has shifted to looking at biomimicry of conventional animal products, as opposed to your sort of traditional veggie bean burger of the past. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is give you an overview of the alternative protein language as we see it, but really focus on the plant-based side. At GFI, when we talk about alternative proteins, we talk about them fitting into 3 categories from a production cost and infrastructure perspective, and we support research and companies in all 3 of these areas. So generating proteins from plants, using microbial fermentation to create ingredients, and using animal cell culture or so-called culture or cultivated meat to produce protein and actual meat from animal cells. And while I'll only talk primarily about plant-based meat and proteins today, if we look off into the future, what we see is an industry that where these animal product alternatives occur along a spectrum, where if you look on this slide, we have fully plant-based products like tofu on the left, fully cultivated or synthetic products like synthetic gelatin or synthetic egg and dairy proteins on the right. But in the middle, these hybrid products, the Impossible Burger, I think is a great example of what's to come. This is primarily plant ingredients, but uses the soy lake hemoglobin that's used as a flavoring ingredient in that product is produced through fermentation technology. So we're likely to see more and more use of plants along with fermented ingredients and even cultivated ingredients like cultivated fat in these products in the future. But as I said, today I wanted to talk about how we use plants. How do we take this source material, some type of crop, and convert it into the tastes and textures that mimic, in this case, meat, but also could be used to mimic egg and dairy products. And I think you all know it's not as simple as just this straight line, right, where we can easily take a crop that grows and exists today and turn it into these texturized meat products. It's far more complex than that. And what I'd like to do is kind of work backwards from the end product and dive into these black boxes here and really end with a discussion on how we can come together to work with crops in more and better ways to create the ingredients that will make these end products, these plant-based meat products, better and better and more appetizing for the omnivores and flexitarians of the world. This is a high-level schematic of plant-based meat production. I won't dwell on this because I think you'll all be familiar with it, but I'll be stepping through these steps in my presentation. So I think it's good just for grounding. So, obviously we're going to have some kind of source material. We're going to need to optimize that in some way, either through breeding or genetic engineering. Once we've done that, we're going to isolate and optimize or functionalize the raw materials. This can be done both through mechanical and chemical or enzymatic methods. Once we've got that expanded, more functional toolbox of ingredients, then those are being brought together in this last segment where food scientists and food chemists, product developers, are combining these ingredients together in novel ways to create the sensory experience that consumers are looking for. I mentioned that a lot of our work at GFI is focused on identifying the most important white space ideas for this industry. And we recently went through a project just to update all of our white space ideas. And this slide here just shows you the process that we went through. So we assembled a number of what we thought were critical questions that were important to the industry, such as, what is the biggest bottleneck in producing plant-based meat egg and dairy products today. We convened global expert panels from the industry, so not only scientists and engineers, but also entrepreneurs and investors, CEOs of larger companies. Once we just collected their input, we used market data that we have access to, that's both public and proprietary consumer market data, to validate the ideas that they had come up with. And now we're in the process of synthesizing and prioritizing those white space opportunities to share with the industry at large. But I'll take you through some of what we think are the most promising and important white space ideas we identified through this project. And our goal is to take these white space ideas and address them. And we do this through a number of ways. We have meetings like this where we talk about them. We use them to advise companies, governments, and universities around the world. We use the data from our white space project to inform the type of research that we fund through our competitive grant program. We plan to publish white papers and technical evaluations using these white space ideas as themes. And then finally, we're very interested in creating more focused research centers where plant biologists and fermentation experts and stem cell biologists can come together and solve these important questions facing the alternative protein industry to really accelerate this industry forward. And there were 4 white space themes that when we looked at just the plant-based meat, egg and dairy sector that popped out during this project. So one was product sensory improvements. The second was expanding manufacturing capacity. The third was looking for alternative production methods, so other ways other than extrusion that we can texturize these plant proteins. And then obviously, and one of the reasons that we're all here today, lots of opportunities to better optimize crops, specifically for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy applications. There are a number of different areas of this entire chain that we can look at, and we came up with ideas in all of these, from the starting at the crop all the way through to even financing and ideas, distribution ideas, food service and retail ideas. But what I'll focus on today for this presentation are these 4 areas. So white space ideas around crop optimization and characterization, different ways or opportunities to optimize the raw materials, novel production methods, and then finally novel and interesting opportunities in the area of product development. How do we bring these ingredients together? What novel ideas can we come up with to create and impart better flavors, colors, and other sensory characteristics on these products? And when we look at these 4 categories, there were many ideas that popped out. Just to touch on a couple of them on this slide, in crop optimization, we had ideas for using waste streams or better utilizing crops that we currently use for other purposes, like maize. There were new ideas for different breeding and bioinformatic techniques. On the raw material side, I'll touch on ideas to valorize whole plants, and we already heard some ideas about that during the introduction part of this meeting. Different alternatives to high moisture extrusion, and then lots of really interesting ideas on the product development side to look at better ways of incorporating fats and encapsulating them in the final product, to different methods to texturize the final product. So usually when I talk about the plant-based meat sector, I start with crops and end with product development. But I thought it would be interesting today, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, to start at the end and work backwards, because I think, as a trained plant biologist, I think that there's so much opportunity to work with the crops at the beginning to provide better raw materials. And I think this is arguably where there are the most important and significant opportunities in this industry, is to better characterize and optimize the crops that we work with. But I think to figure out how we do that, it's important to step backwards from the final product and understand what challenges exist in these other parts of the value chain. So if we think about product development, I think there's some really interesting opportunities here to think about new types of ingredients and even enzymes that we can produce through fermentation technology that can be used to impart better flavors and even functionalize some of the ingredients that we're working with. The classic example that we always talk about is the soy-like hemoglobin that I mentioned earlier from Impossible Foods. They first identified this in the root nodules of soy plants that provided this dark red color and meaty flavor in the Impossible burger. But now, for efficiency's sake and cost, they produce this recombinantly in yeast. And I think there are other interesting examples to think about in the area of texturization and identifying novel enzymes that can work hand in hand with the crops, the specific crops that we're working with, to better functionalize the proteins that we're isolating from those crops. This is an example here from a paper from a few years ago where they worked with different enzymes to cross-link, in this case, soy protein. And what you can see on the graph on the right is that by cross-linking the soy protein, they were able to change the texture, increase the hardness of the soy pudding that they were creating from the soy protein. And you can see in the micrograph down on the right the changes in the structure, resulting in increased hardness. So this is just one really classic example, but I think here there's some really interesting ideas to think about in terms of the proteins that we're extracting from crops and how we could combine novel enzymes with them to improve their functionality for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. In the case of our the research we're funding at GFI, I think there's some really interesting areas in this particular sector of plant-based meat production. So we have a project at UC Berkeley that's looking at oleogels and how to incorporate them into plant-based meats to create a better source of fats to improve the organoleptic experience. At the University of Massachusetts, Julian McClements is coming up with novel ways that don't use extrusion to create fiber-like structures from plant-based proteins. That work's just beginning, but I think there's some really interesting physiochemical and quality attributes that he's gonna identify through his work. Jan Li at Beijing University in China, this was a project we funded last year, is identifying the compounds in pea and other legumes that cause the primary cause of off flavors that lead to consumer dissatisfaction when consuming products that come from pea protein. And he's already identified a number of interesting volatile compounds, and he's currently trying to figure out which are the most important ones. And then BZ is on the call today, so I won't spend a lot of time talking about his project, and I'm sure he can go into more detail later. But his work is looking, as he mentioned earlier, looking at multi-phase fermentation of legumes and grains as a source of organoleptically satisfying flavor bases. Really interesting work, and I hope Ben will take a few minutes later on our call today to talk about his project in more detail. All right, let's step back even one step closer towards the crops. So once we have the raw materials, we often need to further process them to texturize them in some ways, especially when we're talking about plant-based meat. And really the question we're trying to solve, right, is how do we take these globular plant proteins and restructure them in a way that they're more like animal proteins. They're fibrillar, they're cross-linked. We the industry currently relies for the most part on twin screw extrusion to do this, to apply high heat and high temperature to restructure these plant proteins. But there's some interesting work now in the industry to look at alternative ways of doing this, either through mechanical means or enzymatic methods. There's some really interesting work, I think, happening at Wageningen University in the Netherlands to look at shear cell technology. This is applying rotational forces to result in the same end product that would come out of an extruder, so these texturized plant proteins. And we're funding a project in this with shear cell that I'll touch on in a minute. Another, I think, really interesting area is 3D printing. This example here is from a company in Spain called Novamete, but there's some interesting companies in Israel as well that are applying similar techniques to take plant ingredients and create a texturized meat analog product out at the end. I think this is a really promising area of research that I'm personally very excited about. In terms of the research we're funding at GFI through our competitive research grant, Mario Martinez at the University of Guelph in Canada, he's working with traditional extrusion, but identifying novel ways to enhance extrusion, particularly by utilizing low-value byproducts and waste streams. He's currently screened more than 10 promising plant-based protein ingredients, and is currently perfecting the ways that those can be extruded. So I think from Mario's product, we're not only going to learn about some more other interesting proteins that we can work with, new crops that we might be able to work with, but also how we can fine-tune twin screw extrusion based on different protein characteristics to get better texturized products out at the end. Feliz, also in Canada, is creating a new instrumentation for inline monitoring and manipulation of proteins during the processing of them in an extruder. So this is super important as well, because extrusion is somewhat of a black art in that you need a lot of experience to be able to work with different types of proteins from different crops and get the right product out at the end. And the work here will allow a more robust and streamlined process that improves batch-to-batch consistency and allows one to work with a wider pool of different proteins and still get out good product at the other end. At the University of Minnesota, Zata is working on characterizing, texturizing pulse proteins to form meat-like fibers. So we're again going to get out of this project some really nice data sets that help us understand how raw materials work in extrusion and the different ways that we can process those, the different extrusion conditions that will ultimately impact the final sensory characteristics of the plant-based meat product. And then finally, Girish at Washington State University is looking at fava bean proteins, lentil proteins, and combining them with insoluble dietary fibers to improve the quality of these textured pea proteins when taken through an extruder. So this is really interesting work where he's looking at how these dietary fibers can improve the texture of the final product. And then not in the area of improving extrusion, but in this category of novel methods. I mentioned shear cell technology before, and Birgit in the Netherlands, we're funding some work to take this shear cell technology from a prototype stage to a commercial product that can be used by plant-based meat companies around the world to create these whole cut food products from various types of plant proteins using shear cell technology. All right, we're one step away from the crops, and here I just wanted to touch on raw material optimization and novel methods that we're funding, new ideas, white space ideas that exist to optimize these raw materials for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. when we look at the types of proteins that the market uses today to create plant-based meat products, we still continue to rely on soy as the primary input. Pea is gaining market share, and wheat and rice are remaining roughly about the same. We're starting to see a lot of interest in other crops, but for the most part, when we look at the plant-based meat, egg and dairy products that are on the market today, the vast majority of them utilize soy. And in most cases, the soy, wheat, and pea crops that these raw materials are produced from, that plant-based meat, egg, and dairy companies are using, were really designed for other purposes. So in the case of soy, most of the varieties that are grown where we take the soy protein from, the primary product is soybean oil. So the reason I'm sharing this in the raw material slide is that obviously there are ways that we can create better crops and breed better varieties of soy, wheat, and pea to produce better raw materials. But I think there are also opportunities to better utilize these crops that we work with, use the byproducts that come from these, learn how to valorize waste streams and byproducts from other crops that can then be applied to these traditional row crops like soy to get better raw materials out that work for plant-based meat. So while we're expanding our repertoire of crops and even breeding or engineering new varieties of these, we're at the same time coming up with better techniques to use to functionalize and isolate these raw materials for better end products. In terms of some of the white space opportunities and research that we're funding through our competitive grant, I think one really interesting area is side stream utilization or waste stream valorization, and we're funding 2 projects in this area. Again, in the Netherlands, Marieke is looking at new ways to, or the focus really here is to accelerate the adoption of new proteins by looking at a really wide collection of agricultural side streams, and then identifying proteins with the right functional and organoleptic advantages, and at the same time developing new technology platforms to efficiently extract these proteins. So I'm really excited by this project and what new techniques and new proteins we can identify through that work. In Brazil, there's a really interesting project that we're funding that is looking at creating or isolating proteins from cassava leaves that can then be used in the production of plant-based meat. I think this is interesting, not only that it valorizes what is essentially a waste stream from cassava, which is, as you'll know, a very important crop in Brazil, but also we currently, I think, underutilize leaves, and more specifically protein from leaves in a wide variety of plants. So we're really hopeful that not only can we learn how to better valorize cassava for the plant-based meat industry, but these techniques that Anna is working on to isolate proteins from leaves can be used more broadly across the entire industry. In Estonia, Raivo is looking at new ways to apply fermentation specifically to oat protein to create better plant-based meat analogs. So I think this is another interesting area of looking at how we can combine a classic technique like fermentation to improve the texture from a wide variety of cereal grain proteins, and also improve the nutritional profile of these products. In Australia, Clara is taking methods that have existed, such as high pressure processing and high pressure thermal processing, and look at how they can be applied to plant proteins to improve the functionality and flavor of them, leading to, we hope, better ingredients and better plant-based meat products as well. So I think this is exciting because it takes an existing technology and figures out how to apply it to sensory challenges facing the plant-based meat industry to improve both flavor and functionality. Another project in Brazil that we're funding, Caroline, is looking at novel methods to extract proteins from beans as an alternative ingredient for plant-based meat products. Again, this is not, the intention here is really to identify new methods that will result in higher quality proteins with a better cost-benefit ratio for plant-based meat applications. And then finally, in this section here, at Wageningen University, again, Meek is creating tailor-made protein-enriched ingredients or fractions. So looking at new fractionation methods, doing in-depth analyses of structure-function relationships between those novel fractions, and then applying the best fractions to create prototype meat analog products. So I think from this project, again, we're going to find new methods, specifically in the area of fractionation, to create better protein isolates that can be used for plant-based meat production. And then I'll end on crop optimization, and hopefully this stimulates a discussion for the second half of our meeting today. Yeah, this is, I'm sure, obvious to all of you, but really the goal for, as I touched on in the beginning of my presentation, the goal here is to improve the functionality of plant-based meat products so that they have a better sensory experience. But the power of crops is that we can use breeding and editing technologies to not only improve the functionality, but improve the nutrition, improve the yield and performance of these crops, and hopefully at the same time lower the cost of the ingredients that we take from these crops to bring down the end product cost of these plant-based meat products so that they become more competitive on the market. Kind of looking into the future, one of the, I think, crops and end product relationships that I'm particularly interested in is what's being done in the area of wheat and bread. This is a nice paper that was published last year that some of you may be familiar with, where they mapped the genome or genomes of a variety of wheat strains, and look not only at traditional yield and disease resistant traits, but also at quality traits as well, such as protein percentage, color, mixing time, and end product characteristics of different bread products. And I think here, and I'm sure all of you are already aware of this and doing some of it yourself, we can apply the same types of techniques to crops that are relevant for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy applications, and really start to understand how we can manipulate not only quality and yield and disease resistance characteristics, but also the functionality of the ingredients that we're extracting from these crops. So I'll end with the research that we're funding on the crop optimization side. And again, here are some really interesting projects. Dill at Clemson University, we began to fund her work last year. She's established a breeding program to optimize pea and sorghum proteins for plant-based meat applications, and is currently identifying genetic markers for protein quality that will accelerate future breeding. And she already has some really interesting results coming out of her work. Ophir, I think many of you know Ophir, and he's doing some really exciting work working with quinoa as a raw material for plant-based meat products. He's already created a quinoa protein concentrate from his research, and is now working on an isolate that's really exciting. Another example of how we can use novel crops or crops that have been used for other applications and apply them specifically to plant-based meat. Trophic in the U.S. Is a company focused on seaweed innovation. So they are characterizing different types of seaweed ingredients, identifying new methods to extract those proteins and other ingredients from seaweed that will increase our understanding of how we can use seaweed proteins in a plant-based meat product to provide a different type of texture or flavor. They've already obtained and analyzed 5 different commercial varieties of red seaweed in the past year, and they're now in the process of optimizing protein extraction protocols. Anna at Embrapa in Brazil is working with cashew and trying to understand how we can use that as a raw material for plant-based meat products, really with the aim to develop economically feasible technologies to transform cashew apple waste into a valued ingredient for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. So she'll be looking not only at enhancing production, but also extending shelf life and improving the sensory properties of proteins that we can extract from cashew. And then finally,
David, sorry, it's Matat. Can I ask a question?
Of course.
When you talk about the proteins in the raw material, can you give us some scale to what level of protein people are looking at that it will be worth getting it into the process?
Yeah, so in the case of protein concentrates, you're looking at typically something in the, I would say 60% range, and these work well for many applications, but we're seeing a trend for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy companies wanting to work with higher percentage protein isolates that could be, above, say 85% in total protein concentration. So I think that's one. So I guess I'll say 2 things. So creating protein isolates takes a fair amount of processing, which is one of the reasons that we're interested in funding research to identify more efficient ways of isolating proteins from crops. But I think there's also, you could argue that a better way to do this is to breed varieties of crops that have more protein in them, right? So then you have less processing downstream of them. But I would say in general, the trend is towards purer protein isolates that have a more neutral flavor and color, and then more flexible in terms of downstream applications. All right, I will, and we can talk more about that in the discussion section as well. And then I'll end with another seaweed project, but this one in Israel, in Yoav's group at the Technion. Yoav is looking at creating seafood analogs using seaweed protein-rich extracts. That work is just beginning, but also really exciting, looking at different types of marine microalgae as the main raw material for seafood alternative products. And then I'll mention a couple of consortiums that or projects that we're involved in. Smart Protein is a Horizon 2020 project funded through the EU government that we're a partner in. Also, Equinom, I think all of you are familiar with, are also a partner in that project. And in that, the work has just begun, but we'll be optimizing quinoa, fava bean, lentil, and chickpea, creating new variants of these crops that are designed specifically for plant-based food applications, but also coming up with new isolation and functionalization methods, and even creating prototype end products that will be launched onto the market. So a really exciting multi-year project that is just getting going. The second one on this slide is a project that Sid Arthur from our team, who's on the call, is involved in, and this is a partnership with ICRISAT in India, funded through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, to optimize varieties of millet for plant-based food applications, high protein snacks, and ultimately having better ingredients from millet for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy applications as well. And then finally, we're involved in a Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research initiative in the US called Crops of the Future, to fund research in exploring new and underutilized crops with an emphasis on legumes, again, to create better crops, better raw materials for, specifically in this case, for plant-based food applications. And then to end off, I'm going to highlight when we went through this white space ideation project that I mentioned before, we identified about 100 different ideas, and through our market analyses and then consulting with the external experts again, these I think are 4 of the most promising white space opportunities that I wanted to mention. So the first is end-to-end product development and co-manufacturing. So one of the biggest bottlenecks that faces this industry today is access to manufacturing equipment, whether that's isolating the raw materials from the crops, or in most cases, access to extruders or co-manufacturing facilities. So this is currently a big bottleneck facing the industry, huge demand for plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products, but not enough capacity to actually test and manufacture them. So we see a big white space opportunity for the industry to come together and create these end-to-end product development and scale up co-manufacturing facilities. I mentioned seafood briefly before with some of the research that we're funding, but this is a really wide open area, and I think interesting to think about in terms of how we work with crops, which crops we work with, which are going to work best for seafood applications. Plant-based seafood today accounts for about a 1% share of the overall plant-based meat market, so massive opportunities to create better plant-based seafood products with better sensory profiles. I know many of you on this call today are working with bioinformatics to better understand crops. Here, I think there's really interesting opportunities to think about bioinformatics from not just a crop analysis and improvement perspective, but also to better understand protein functionality as well, and really bring together those 2 data sets to allow the industry to make better decisions on which crops and which protein isolates from those crops to work with to create better end products. And then finally, a more specific example is around cheese. Currently, plant-based cheeses are pretty poor, I would say, in terms of functionality, especially around meltability and stretch of cheese. So I think this is another area, again, where we can think about which are the right crops to work with that have proteins and fats in them that can impart the right functional characteristics onto a plant-based cheese product. So I think what I hope I've done today is kind of given you a glimpse into these black boxes and some of the opportunities to improve the processes and techniques and crops that we work with to create plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products. And I'll end kind of like thinking about this entire industry and how we can better utilize plants, and thinking about it as a new feed industry where we can take the high molecular weight proteins from plants or from waste streams and use them as inputs to plant-based meat, egg, and dairy products, as I've spoken about in my presentation. But there are other parts of the plants that we can valorize as well for this broader alternative protein industry. The amino acids and small peptides that we can extract from plants can be used as feedstock to culture animal cells for cultivated meat production. We can use the simple sugars and longer polysaccharides from plants and waste streams as well as feedstock for microbial fermentation to produce ingredients for this industry, or even to produce scaffolds for cultivated meat applications. Actually, Tom from our team has a really interesting paper coming out later today that looks at novel methods to use texturized plant proteins to aid in the growth of bovine cells for cultivated meat. We have a lot of resources on our website, much more in-depth analyses of the market if you're interested, deeper dives into the science and technology, and even policy briefings as well. And you can find all of this on our resources page at gfi.org/resources. So thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting and stimulated some ideas and thoughts and questions. And so I'll end here and then open the floor for a discussion session. Happy to answer questions as well.